Good afternoon. I welcome all of you for this distinguished lecture. I especially welcome our distinguished speaker, Dr. Davesh, Soneji, and also the other distinguished speaker and performer, Dr. Yashoda Thakore. I am happy that I am here because I am a student of social anthropology studying these social institutions. And then whatever we study in the contemporary society, we also have to start from the history. So this is actually a social history linked to the performance. And like all of you, I am also looking forward to listen to the distinguished speaker and also to witness the performance. And both these speakers are not new to us, but they will be formally introduced by the professors of SN School and also School of Social Sciences. First, I request Professor B. Ananthakrishnan, followed by Professor Sheila Prasad, for introducing the distinguished speakers. Thank you.
Dr. Davesh Soneji is not unfamiliar person to the University of Hyderabad because he was a visiting professor here at SN School. But again, I will give a brief introduction about him, though we are started late. Davesh Soneji is Associate Professor in the Department of South Asian Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. His recent research interests lie at the intersections of social and cultural history, religion and anthropology. For the past 2 decades, he has produced research that focuses primarily on religion and the performing arts in South India, but also includes works on gender, class, caste and colonialism. He is best known for his work on social history of professional female artists in Tamil and Telugu-speaking South India, and is author of Unfinished Gestures, Devadasi's Memory and Modernity in South India, published by University of Chicago Press, which was awarded the 2013 Bernard S. Cohen Prize, book prize from the Association for Asian Studies. He is also editor of Bharatanatyam, a reader, Oxford University Press, 2010, and co-editor with Indira Vishwanathan Peterson of Performing Past, Reinventing the Arts in Modern South India. He is presently co-editing another volume entitled Dance and the Early South Indian Cinema. Professor Soneji has recently held positions as visiting professor in many places, many universities. And prior to coming to the University of Pennsylvania, Professor Soneji taught at McGill University of Montreal, Canada for over 12 years. Professor Soneji is also the co-founder and director of the Mangala Initiative, a non-profit organization centered on social justice issues and hereditary performing arts in South India. He is currently working a new book on the social history of classical music and musical production in South India from the late 18th to the mid 20th centuries. So now I request Professor Sheila to introduce Yashoda.
Thank you. Before I introduce Yashoda to the audience, I would just like to thank also Professor Venkatrao for readily agreeing. He wasn't very sure what his role is going to be today in the afternoon, but I think I bullied him a bit, and as usual, he said okay, and here he is. Thank you so much, Professor Venkatrao, for that late kind of intimation. I would like to thank both Davesh and Yashoda for this distinguished lecture because this is something that is a collaborative effort between SIP and the Center for Regional Studies in the School of Social Sciences. And this is a kind of collaboration I think that we all really look forward to. So I also want to thank Ananthakrishnan, Director SIP, for agreeing to co-host this. On behalf of the center, a bit about the center before I go on to Yashoda. This is really for us at the center, which is a Center for Regional Studies, a very, very apt beginning to our academic activities in terms of a distinguished lecture for this year. Because in a sense, I think the talk and the performance and what all it signifies foregrounds region. And for us, that's really, really important, because we see region resonating in the little abstract that was shared and in the conversations that one has had with Yashoda on this particular lecture. I'd like to begin with a little personal anecdote about my own foray into first really learning about courtesan dance. This was I was going through The Economist of April 2015, and in the obit page, which is the last page of The Economist, I was really pleasantly surprised to read about Shashimani Devi, who died at the age of 92 and who was a Mahari, the last human consort of Lord Jagannath, in the Puri temple. And so there was a little bit of loyalty there, because I too come from Orissa, and I was wondering, I've never heard of her. In all my years of going to Orissa and reading about Orissa's history, this was absolutely invisible, hidden. So that is when I started reading up a bit, and then it kind of all came together when Yashoda said that, would the center be interested in this? So thank you both Davesh and Yashoda for this. Okay, about Yashoda, I think both our speakers today are, deeply invested in reclaiming the history about a group of dancers who was so important in a certain period of history, and then who suddenly, became victims of stigmatization and were kind of hidden from history. So today we hear of the classical dances of Bharatnatyam, Kuchipudi, Odissi, but all these mainstream dances have borrowed from the repertoire of these courtesan dances, which have different names in different regions of India. And I think one should appreciate Yashoda's, effort to sort of give these dances and the dancers, within quotes, respectability and a certain legitimacy in the narrative of mainstream dances. And I think that is a singular contribution. I'm not going to read what degrees she has and what all she's written, because, you can go on the net and see all that. But I think this is something that is far more important to share. But just for our HCU fraternity, Yashoda is an alumni of our university from the Department of Dance, where she did both her MA and her PhD. So, it's like homecoming maybe for her. And we can also cheer that one of us is, doing this great effort of, sort of bringing back a part of history that needs to be foregrounded. I also, Yashoda's, I think she began with Kuchipudi under Shobha Naidu, and then moved to, I think this urge to kind of go off the beaten track, to sort of push the envelope. She moved into Vilasini Natyam under Swapna Sundari, and that also was not enough. I think she wanted to sort of, she makes a distinction between Vilasini Natyam and the courtesan dances. And that's when she sort of began, going back, as she says, to her roots. And I think that personal story is a story that is worth listening to. And she will bring her rich experience of a dancer into, this performance that will be supplemented by Davesh's text and, theorizing. two little things about Yashoda before I end. She's received a lot of awards. Please, Yashoda, don't blame me if I'm not reading it out, but I think it's, it's there. Okay, she's one of those dancers who personally I respect tremendously because of this thing of moving, enlarging the space of dance and the meaning of dancers and dance. Another personal note, which, my association with Yashoda does go back a long way, because she also taught Kuchipudi to my daughter. But I'm now wishing she had taught her also the new forms, which is, I think, more exciting than just Kuchipudi. So to end with her own words, Yashoda, in some interview which I, got on the net as usual, I want people to focus on the art and not on the stigma of these dancers. And I think that is what we're going to sort of enjoy in the next 1 hour. Thank you so much, both of you. And I also want to thank the two people who are on, singing. I also want to thank Sudha Garu, who's lending the vocals, and Chandrakant on the mridangam. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to begin by thanking the university at large for hosting us. There are so many people here, from the administration to faculty members, colleagues who I haven't seen in years and years, and it's just so wonderful to have everybody here. So thank you all, and thank you to the university. Also, a big thank you to the Study in India program, and finally, of course, to the Center for Regional Studies, and especially Professor Sheila Prasad, who's really gone out of her way, I think, to enable this event. So thank you so much. For the past 2.5 decades, I have been working on the social history of women in devadasi communities from the Telugu-speaking Andhra region, where these women are largely known by the local professional title Kalavant, artist, or in plural, Kalavanthulu. Today, my colleague Dr. Yashoda Thakore and I present some deliberations on the complex ways in which social history, performance, and contemporary identity are deeply intertwined in the life worlds of women from this community. Our presentation begins with notes on the 20th century historical debates around this community, and then we move on to some autobiographical remarks by Yashoda, and end with 4 short repertory dance and music pieces from the community that we hope will illustrate why embodied memory and somatic politics need to be taken seriously in any critical deliberations on this subject. The logic of devadasi reform, articulated by women reformers such as Muthulakshmi Reddy, was ubiquitously couched in the language of a nationalist patriarchy that naturalized female chastity and marital fidelity and rendered it part of the common sense of the middle class. This logic worked through the negotiation of the public and private spheres, extending through legal intervention and a cumulative intrusion of criminal law into the realm of sexuality and economics. A few of the women from this community who refashioned themselves as good wives during the reform period were and continue to be singled out as exemplary devadasis, but the vast majority of devadasis did not, and indeed could not, be integrated into the moral economy of India's emergent middle class. In the families of such unintegrated individuals, we encounter women's marginalization with all of its complexities. Some women are commercial sex workers in cities like Chennai and towns like Pedapuram. Some continue to live as the second wives or concubines of members of the civic elite. Some settle into caste endogamous marriages. And the older generation of women who actually lived through the period of radical social reform invariably see themselves as inhabiting the borderlands of modern citizenship. The fact of the matter is that legislation did not eradicate this community, and today, young women from this community lead complex lives. Stigma, suspicion, and the negotiation of social identity, which elsewhere I've called passing, are all deep and yet quotidian issues managed by women in this community today. In each of these contexts, Kalavanthulu women find themselves hinged to early 20th century representations that are difficult for them at best, debilitating at worst. Here, I would argue that we also encounter censorship, understood as corporeal surveillance, the patrolling of moral and aesthetic boundaries, and the regulation of culture in all of its forms, from the most explicit state-endorsed criminalization of women's performance practices, which I'll talk about in a moment, to the most subtle forms of local gossip, which pervades not only rural social economies, but is epidemic in the new industry of South India's so-called classical dance and music. Today, this social category of Kalavanthulu is pervaded by historical fissures, lived trauma, and a complex and problematic relationship with hegemonic, state-endorsed understandings of gender justice. In 1927, Muthulakshmi Reddy, the first female legislator in colonial India, and someone we might call anachronistically a first-wave feminist, proposed an amendment to the Madras Hindu Religious Endowments Act of 1926 that would give hereditary Inam lands, that is, the tax-free lands that some Devadasis received for their affiliation with temples, over to Devadasis without any further obligation for the women to perform music or dance in the temple or to quote-unquote dedicate girls in this context. This was the crux of the anti-Nach argument, that women's entry into sex work could be curtailed if the so-called dedication rituals, and I keep using scare quotes for that because that is a term that's actually coined in the process of reform, that these dedication rituals in which women's labor in temples was pledged through a public ceremony known in Tamil as Bottu Kattudal was criminalized. According to the amendment, in contexts where Devadasis received a portion of the revenue from the land, as in the case of cultivated land, for example, they would continue to receive this for the span of their lifetime, after which it would be given over to temple authorities. This was passed as Act 5 of 1929, and for those of you who are not familiar with the genealogy of Devadasi reform in colonial Madras, this intervention, Act 5, predates Reddy's 1930 bill, which is entitled A Bill to Prevent the Dedication of Women to Hindu Temples, which 20 years later leads to the now infamous Madras Devadasis Prevention of Dedication Act of 1947, which was passed by independent India. Reddy's 1927 proposal elicited a range of responses from women in Devadasi communities, including a vast number of protest letters and memos that are preserved in Reddy's personal files. The most well-known of these come from an English document entitled A Memorandum Submitted on Behalf of the Madras Presidency Devadasis Association. The memo is signed by 8 members of the association, whose members included prominent Devadasis of the city, including the famous vocalist Bangalore Nagaratnammal, whose signature you can see there. It is based on earlier documents, actually, composed by individual women, such as this one written in Tamil by T. Duraikannu, a famous dancer, and is also followed by a number of replicas from nearly all the Tamil-speaking regions of the presidency, as we see here in this memo from Tirunelveli district in the deep south. These protest letters bear an incredible uniformity, not only in form, but also in content. They critique the limiting ways in which Devadasi identity has been essentially constructed in the public sphere as sex work, and are couched in the language of nation and religion, arguing, ultimately, that there are possibilities for Devadasis and their offspring to inhabit the spaces of nationalist modernity. Organizations such as the Madras Devadasis Association caused a considerable stir in the press. One English newspaper report called the protest, quote-unquote, extremely revolting, and another labeled the resistance, quote, ignorant opposition engineered by disinterested parties. While Reddy herself, in a letter to A.R. McEwen, Secretary of the Government of Madras, reacts with the following remarks, quote, In the first place, it is well known that the very word devadasi has come to mean a prostitute. Therefore, I cannot understand how a petition from an association of such women could be countenanced and further sent out for opinion from others. The fact that one or two devadasis out of hundreds and thousands have made a name in the world of music and dancing does not disprove that 999 out of 1,000 are prostitutes, and 1 in 1,000 of them the mistress of a married man. Exceptions do not make a rule, end quote. In most cases, especially in the Telugu-speaking regions of the presidency, the promise of the bill to enfranchise lands to devadasis caused uproar. Men who wanted to lay claim to a portion of the lands could not have them enfranchised, since the amendment, Muthulakshmi Reddy's amendment, only applied to women. Inam deeds were thus instantly rewritten so that now men became registered property holders, and in some cases, Inam deeds were suddenly lost, just happened to be lost, by families or temple administrators. So in a case from the Sri Venkateshwara Swami and Sri Vishveshwara Swami temple in Vadapalli in East Godavari district, dated November 1929, temple trustees object to the enfranchisement of temple lands to professional dancing women who performed on occasion at the temple. The trustees argued that, quote, there has never been any custom or practice of dedicating young girls for service in Hindu temples in this district, and hence the Hindu Endowments Religious Act does not apply to them. End quote. They explained that, quote, portions of the Inam lands are enjoyed by men for the service of fiddling, etc., done by them in connection with the dancing service by nautch parties in temples. The men enjoy portions of the Inam as registered holders, end quote. Of course, none of this was true. These are all being manufactured in this very moment. And thus, even after the bill to enfranchise lands in the names of women was passed, it remained almost impossible for women to access. Here, we see a petition noting that 2 Kalāvantula women, Dharanikota Samrajyam and Kalavasasiruham, who are holders of Inam lands from the Sri Venkateshwara Someshwara Kudaleshwara Swami temple at Sekur in Guntur district, have not successfully had land enfranchised in their names after the passing of the bill. Temple authorities magically produce an 1899 document that will supposedly not allow the enfranchisement of the Inams in their names, the authority and interpretation of which these women are disputing in this letter. Reddy also received a number of letters from men who challenged her decision to enfranchise land only in the name of women from their own communities. They formed caste associations, restyled themselves as a new caste group called Surya Balija, locating themselves in a quote-unquote respectable caste position, that of Balija, mirroring the Tamil reinvention of the same community under the name Isai Velalar, where they would plug themselves into the Velalar category, which is a respectable agricultural caste. So the newly formed all-male Devadasi and Kalavantula Samskaranam Association of Bezawada Taluk, for example, which we see here in this document, expressed its concern over the gendered implications of the enfranchisement of the Inams in the following way, quote, it has been the constant custom of the males as well as the females of this association to hold the Inam grants granted to them in lieu of the services in the temples, which they jointly, with strict mutual aid, turned out without fail. Accordingly, both sexes had equal rights to the Inam lands. But on observing the recent circular of the Honorable Inam Commissioner to enfranchise only those lands that are directly in the possession and enjoyment of the females only, all of us turned pessimistic over the future success in the reform of the said association. End quote. This argument, of course, has a legacy, an ongoing legacy. Men from Devadasi communities continue to vie for women's Inam lands well into the 20th century. In Madras High Court cases as late as 2016, the legal record preserves imprints of the highly gendered early 20th century discourses we have been discussing here. At the high point of such debates about Inam rights and economic sustenance, We also have histories of the forceful breakup of Kalavanthula households through forced rehabilitation centers that were called Yuvati Sharanalayams and were set up throughout the presidency for a period of more than 10 years, where Kalavanthula women were literally domesticated and taken away from their children. Additionally, remember that it was in this very moment that, beginning around 1931 actually, that non-devadasi elites in Madras began a vociferous movement to appropriate the music and dance practices of both Tamil and Telugu-speaking devadasi women for the purpose of creating a nationalist representation of India's classical past. This movement has also not ended. Iterations of this cycle of appropriation continue into our own times, often with upper caste women dressing up like devadasis, reclaiming old names for devadasi performance like sadir, and thus closing up any space that was left for women from this community to represent and speak for themselves in today's art world. As I've argued in my book Unfinished Gestures, discursive historicizations of devadasi reform, as I've just done, cannot be understood without asking the question of what happens in this community after 1947, when independent India transforms Reddy's bill into an act. The Act of 1947 is itself a vague document that focuses squarely on the ritual and temple-based roles of devadasis, which did not, as I've argued in my book, really reflect the reality of women's lives in this period. Here, for example, we see a case from the Madras High Court in 1950, in which 8 Telugu-speaking Kalavanthulu and 6 of their musicians, quote, took part in a melam or notch in celebration of the marriage of the first accused along the streets of Mukamala. The first accused, in this case, was a man named Saride Narayana, who was from the Kalavanthula community and married on June 17th in the village of Mukamala in East Godavari district. The court ultimately ruled that the troupe was in fact not violating the terms of the Act of 1947 because the performance was not by women who were dedicated to temple deities, as I've also argued in my book that this was actually the norm, that only very few of these women actually had temple connections. Nor did this performance take place in a temple. It was a marriage procession. Because of the persistence of such secular performances by Kalavanthula women, on August 14th, 1956, the newly formed Andhra Pradesh state government, remember this is the same year that AP was formed as a state, the AP state government carried out a final amendment to the act, which outlawed dancing at marriages and other private social events as well. So now dancing by any Kalavanthula woman in any context, public or private, was thus criminalized. It is significant, of course, that the salon-style private performances of Kalavanthula troupes known by the Urdu-derived word mezavani continued with much regularity in coastal Andhra well into the 1970s and 1980s, despite the constant threat of violence, police raids, and dire forms of legal intervention. So perhaps most importantly, I want to stress that these discursive representations are actually full of lack. They lack the power of voice and somatic presence when we are talking about a living community. For this reason, as I've argued in my book, autobiographical telling, that is, narrations of selfhood, are central to understanding the deep structures that are at work here. My friend, colleague, and interlocutor for close to a decade now, Dr. Yashoda Thakore, lives and works in spaces of identity that are deeply intersectional and highly mediated. And so, it's acutely necessary that today we hear her own articulatory practice, her own voicing of self.
I must admit, I'm only used to people being politely silent about my identity, my caste, and even if I am not, they are. And here, in this polite yet painful silence, lies the key to understanding the highly fragmented and often contradictory lives of young women from our community. I come from the Kalavanthulu community. My ancestors, Chadalavada Madhuravani and Pichai, are probably of the last dancer-singers well known for their expressional skill and singing prowess of the coastal Andhra region. Following the death of their patrons, the Little Kings or the Zamindars, around the town of Annavaram, they moved to the town of Kovur. Madhuravani's son was Gopinatham and Pichai's son was Jagannatham. So, my maternal grandmother, Amamma as I will now call her, Chadalavada Kausalya, was the granddaughter of Madhuravani, the son of Gopinatham. Amamma was very well educated, though all the education took place at home. She had tutors for math, English, Sanskrit and violin. No dance teacher though at that time. She was not allowed to see her paternal grandmother dance. But of course, Amamma and her sister would secretly snatch glimpses of Madhuravani anyway. At the age of 99, when Amamma was bedridden, she could sing songs such as the Varnam of the Raga Navroz, which Kalavanthulu performers are known for. And she sang them as if she learned them yesterday. And as if in a reverie, she used to describe Madhuram's beauty and Pichai's song. She would say, Madhuram was beautiful and fair, not dark like you. But you did inherit her eyes. You don't dress like them though. She wore lovely chain-like anklets. Incidentally, before she died at 105, she made an arrangement for me to wear such anklets. My father, Mr. C. Seshagiri Rao, who also belongs to the Kalavanthulu community, says I declared at the age of 3 that I wanted to be a dancer. My Amamma and mother, Lakshmi, were delighted, but the extended family was dismayed. My actual introduction to dance was only around age 5 when television came to Hyderabad and I saw many urban diva dancers on television. When I was around 7, the famous Kuchipudi dance guru, Dr. Vempati Chinnasatyam, opened the Kuchipudi Dance Academy and I was enrolled in classes there. I learnt Kuchipudi for 14 years under Srimati Shobha Naidu, one of Chinnasatyam's disciples. My father was highly placed in the government and we were fine economically. I grew up in a very middle-class environment. So caste and community really did not matter. Or so I thought. By age 18, I was an active dancer studying at college for my graduation in math, physics and chemistry. Suddenly things began to change. My features were taken notice of. Musicians would say, "You're very beautiful. These features are characteristic of your family." Taking this as a compliment to my mother, I told her, not realizing all the implications of such statements. Then there was also another well-meaning theatre personality who often watched my dance performances and asked me one day, "What is it that makes your dance different from others?" I didn't know. I didn't even know if it was a compliment at that time. This was the point at which my parents decided to tell me about the community. In their words, our people belong to a community called Kalavanthulu. They were temple dancers ages ago. We don't know anything about it. But when stricken by poverty due to changing situations, the women became keeps for zamindars and the landed gentry. I was very excited. I actually couldn't understand why we hid the fact. "Because we were called prostitutes," said my mother. It then dawned on me that most people around me knew this, even when I did not. I then understood where statements like, "Of course she is amicable," came from, and such statements began to take on a rather uncomfortable resonance. My mother taught me to be proud and declared when asked that I belong to the Kalavanthulu community. My father ultimately wanted me to study engineering or business, but the lure of masters in dance was too much to resist. I did my masters in dance in this very university. It was perhaps oddly in an academic context that my first introduction to what was called the devadasi system took place. In some of my classes, devadasis were simultaneously made the objects of admiration, fear, ridicule, and sometimes even jealousy. It sometimes felt that people were obsessed with the subject even as they censored discussions on it. At the university, late Dr. Nataraj Ramakrishnan, a dance teacher and scholar who had worked extensively with women from my community between the 1950s and 70s, suggested that I marry a certain person from the same community. He will marry you. He's from the same community, I was told. Relatives also told me how important it was for me to get married, especially because I was dancing in public. As we have seen in Davesh's work, the compulsions, pressures, and demands around caste endogamous marriage for young women from our community today are directly linked to the reform debates of the early 20th century. At this stage, I entered an intercaste marriage and also decided that I would not shy away from asserting my Kalavanthulu background in public with pride. If I want others to do it, I must begin. I began to pursue various avenues through which I could access the artistic traditions of our community. I began by trying to practice a recently reconstructed and nationalized form of the Kalavantula art, which goes by the name Vilasini Natyam. But there was something more I was looking for. I then met Davesh, and together we traveled to his early research sites and reconnected with women from the very area of East Godavari that my family is from. A few relatives shut their doors on me. Others advised me to dance. They asked me to forget about this and instead dance and choreograph to Sanskrit religious texts like the Vishnu Sahasranama. The supportive ones said, "You've decided to take it up and we are with you." Amamma too was very happy. I was performing the traditional courtly and salon repertoire called Mezuvani. Once, she propped herself up and asked me to perform a padam for her. "Not bad," she said. "You need to sing better though. And you also need to wear some jewelry," she said. Now, years later, I keep the journey going, unwilling to be shaken by the range of gazes, words, and actions that continue to be cast upon us.
So, just as Devadasis and their non-conjugal sexuality simply could not be accommodated by the modern nation state, in a somewhat parallel manner, the aesthetics of their dance, construed as vulgar or distasteful, had to be reworked for dance to be meaningful to middle-class audiences. Indeed, one could very well argue that in a baby and bathwater mode, Devadasi dance practices were reinvented as fundamentally spiritual for nationalist aims by Indian elites, while Devadasis themselves remained at the extreme fringes of citizenship in the modern nation state. Indeed, in today's India, reconstituted forms like Bharatanatyam and even Carnatic music have lived up to the logical end of their reinvention in the 1930s. That is, they have become vehicles for the expression of nationalist politics, but through an imagined history that simply cannot stand up to critical historical scrutiny. For us, by contrast, art is never produced in a vacuum, somehow hermetically sealed from wider social and political forces. Conversely, the social world and meaning in that world is only produced by forms of self-expression, such as music and dance. The separation of the art from the traditional artist, the isolation of dance from its performance ecology, produces and replicates forms of social hierarchy and inequality, and only further marginalizes individuals who were already on the social fringes. We thus locate dance and music not in a trans-historical or pan-Indian Sanskritic context, but rather in the very local vernacular social histories of a large and resilient community of professional artists. I'd also like to add that for us, this type of performance is not about making claims about something that is pure or authentic. And I think that's actually one of the most common readings of people who, even people from outside the Kalāvantulu community, who try to reclaim these devadasi dances, and they say, we're going back to the source, back to the original, back to purity, back to authenticity. We don't make any of those claims. On the contrary, our work stands in opposition to those who play devadasi dress up and make such claims. Our interpretation aims to recognize the mediated nature of all such performance practices that are available to us today, and uses this mode of performing as a way of opening up space for contemporary women's representation in and from the devadasi community. So we begin the performance part of today's presentation actually not with live performance, but with video, largely to make a point about today's public representations of women from the devadasi community. The middle class in India today generally encounters women from devadasi community largely as historical ghosts or signs of an archaic past. Thus, we either see old colonial photographs of nameless dancing girls and nautch women, which are as much objects of curiosity for today's middle class as they were for the colonial administrators who produced them. Or we see 20th century photos and videos compiled by agencies like the Sangeet Natak Academy, in which older women, who are usually hunched over and in a very sad state of affairs, perform abhinaya that invokes a superficial and performative pathos and nostalgia, and sometimes even judgment from the middle class, even as they hungrily devour these women's repertoire and technique. Right? And those of you who have been part of the dance world would have seen how devadasi repertoire is like a jackpot, because it will set one middle-class dancer aside from the 10,000 other Bharatanatyam dancers who happen to be vying for slots in music and dance performances. And this kind of pillaging goes on and on and on, as it has been going on since the 1930s. These are frozen, stilted representations that make us believe that this reality is a reality of the past. We want to break this tired, paradigmatic representation by opening our performance with a young and vibrant performer in this community today, to have us collectively confront the persistence of dance in this community as a living practice against all odds, and to force us to think about the exclusionary politics that keep such young women sealed off from the elite world of the performing arts. We will be watching Bharati, the niece of Annabatula Mangatayaru and Annabatula's Leela Sai of Mummudivaram village in East Godavari district. This family has for at least 6 known generations been active performers in the coastal Andhra region. The piece Bharati performs is Pallavi. In the Pallavi, one line of music is repeated over and over again, and the dancer performs specific sets of predetermined movements, or adavu samu, in varying speeds. In many ways, the movement in the Pallavi is congruous with what are called Poi Adavus, the Poi Adavu sections of a piece called Jatiswaram in the modern Bharatanatyam repertoire that some of you may be familiar with. But unlike the Jatiswaram, there are no korvais or complex rhythmic clusters here, nor are there any cross-rhythmic interjections. Everything is performed in counts of 4, or sarvalagu, with slight tempo variations providing the animation for the piece. The origins of the Pallavi are somewhat uncertain, but what we can say for sure is that a set of Telugu manuscripts from the Vijayanagaram Samasthanam dating back about 150 years gives us several examples of such Pallavis. In the video we are screening today, Bharati performs the Pallavi in Manirangu Raga. Unfortunately, because of time constraints, we're actually presenting a heavily edited version of Bharati's performance, just to sort of make this point and have you see some of the texture of that kind of performance. So now we move on to the live performance part of what we're going to be doing today. And again, I'm hoping that you will see how the repertoire that we've chosen is actually a repertoire that hopefully will resonate with some of the ideas I was talking about earlier with regard to embodied memory, somatic politics, and will force us to think about the intertwined nature of these things, as the title of our talk says. So the first piece Yashoda will perform is from the signature genre of the Kalavanthulu community, the Javali. The Javali is a short, usually upbeat piece of love poetry that was developed in the 19th century, initially through courtly patronage at Mysore, but spread throughout South India very quickly thanks to the movement of devadasis and their male dance masters in the emergent worlds of Tamil and Telugu drama, gramophone recording, and later the cinema. In coastal Andhra at the beginning of the 20th century, Javalis were the mainstay of Kalāvantula performance in salon contexts. Today, we begin with a Javali that has not been performed in public since the disappearance of female public performers from the public eye. The silence around this Javali we actually interpret as a metaphor for the absence of Kalāvantula women's bodies in the art world today. It is precisely this kind of material that was excised from the repertoire when courtesan art forms were reconstituted as amateur religious dance practices put to the service of the nation. This Javali addresses a somewhat taboo subject among today's upper and middle classes, namely that of menstruation. In this Javali, the heroine is menstruating and chides the hero, the god Krishna, who has approached her for his sexual pleasure. She essentially tells him that he is the one who has made these rules of menstrual pollution anyways, and so now he will have to wait for the next 3 days if he wants his desires fulfilled. She also marks her own desire during her menstrual period by invoking Kamadeva, and the text of the Javali we'll be performing is as follows. It's that time of the month, what can I do? This is not the time for you to come close to me, right? That God of love has no mercy, at least for 3 days of every month. But, Lord of Naupuri with a gentle heart, don't be disappointed. In just another 2 days, I will give you much pleasure. Yashoda and I have chosen this song today partly also in memory of the late Saride Maithili, in whose repertoire this song figured very prominently, and who was not only an interlocutor, but also a mentor to me personally for a number of years. So the next piece is a padam, again another mainstay of the Kalavanthulu repertoire. This is a padam that usually is attributed to the 17th century Telugu poet Kshetraya. As I've tried to show elsewhere, the historicity of the figure of Kshetraya, of course, is a big question mark. But the point is, this particular text was extremely popular among Kalavanthulu performers in the 19th and the early part of the 20th century. The padam is also mentioned as an active piece in the repertoire of courtesans in and around the town of Kakinada in the early 20th century by Devulapalli Veeraraghava Shastri in his 1915 work, Abhinaya Swayambodhini. Here, on page 141 of the work, the author provides an annotated documentation of the padam, which he claims he has seen courtesans performing, with cues on how to perform abhinaya or lyrical interpretation through gestures for each word. The poem itself is among the more erotic pieces in the courtesan repertoire. It too has largely been censored by the modern world of Indian classical dance, perhaps because in it, the heroine mocks her lover Krishna for not being able to satisfy her sexually. It is a rare example of the explicit voicing of a woman's own sexual desire. The beginning of the padam, which we'll be performing today, goes as follows. If only one round of lovemaking makes you so tired, what kind of love is this? Come, fulfill my desires, Krishna Muva Gopala. Why is it that the beauty of your lovemaking has become so tired and withered? If only one round. This padam was singled out during the early phases of the so-called reinvention of South India's dance as a piece that was not suitable for family women, quote-unquote, to perform. So E. Krishna Iyer, one of the self-proclaimed rescuers of the art of dance, claimed on many occasions that he had focused much of his efforts on, quote, as he says here, taking the art out of the hands of the old professional class and introducing it among cultured family women of respectable classes, end quote. In 1952, he writes a preface to a Telugu collection of Kshetraya's poems. In it, he asks, is it proper to encourage present-day family girls to go in for Kshetraya padas? At any rate, can a pada, like Okasarike, which we're performing today, ever be touched by our girls? End quote. Today, in memory of the late Maddula Venkataratnam, perhaps one of the greatest Kalāvantula artists of our time, we will be performing the padam as per her rendition. That includes the usage of a unique set of hand gestures called rati mudras, which are used to depict sexual union, and that have all but disappeared from most reinvented forms of South Indian dance. You'll see that in this form of representation, it's a very complex technique. We don't have too much time to talk about it, but essentially phrases and words are broken up, isolated, and repeated again and again and again. And the dancer performs variations of abhinaya to either a phrase, sometimes even just one word. So here, the phrase Wakkasarike is repeated over and over, and at that time you will see the deployment of the rati mudras in that interpretation. So also, the last song I forgot to mention was in Kalyani Raga and Rupakatala. This one is basically in the Raga Mohana, but occasionally the note Ni, which is not usually heard in Mohana today, is inserted just to heighten the bhava. So, Cheragumase in Mohana. I'm sorry, Okasarike in Mohana. We end today's presentation with another Javali. This is called Boti Talagalene, of unknown authorship from the Godavari region. This piece is actually unique to the Annabatula family, members of whom we've already met earlier in the talk. And it was taught to Yashoda by Annaputula Mangatayaru, a fifth-generation performer in this family. It is a very playful song in both text and melody, and gives us a sense of the deeply intermedial presence of Kalavantula culture in the early decades of the 20th century when it was composed. Kalavantula artists were giving live performances at this time, of course, but were also engaged with the new medial forms of gramophone recording, modern Telugu drama, and of course the early cinema. The mood of this Javali captures, we believe, the spirit of women's tireless attempts to script themselves into this new 20th century modernity, an attempt that of course failed because they were overshadowed. The text of the song reads as follows. Girl, Boti, I can't take it anymore. Hi, hi. Listen to me and bring my beloved as soon as you can. He winked at me and asked me to come to a secret place behind the shrubs and the hillocks. He's a good man and so handsome, I can't forget him even if I try. While I was asleep in my mansion, this handsome Ranga pleaded that I show him my face. He touched my breast, and before I knew it, he kissed me and just went away. I can't open my heart and tell you all that he's done to me. How can I bear this? I see him even when I close my eyes. With this, we will end our presentation and open the floor for questions afterwards. So thank you all very much. Okay, we can both answer, I think, in different ways. I'll just give you my perspective. One thing that I've tirelessly worked against is, even though a lot of the examples related to social reform, of course, related to temples, because the social reform movement itself was obsessed with temples. But actually what social reform was trying to do was trying to get rid of the mainstay of courtesan performance, which had nothing to do with temples. It was public performance that I call, in private context, I call it mezwani, and when it's public, we refer to it by a whole range of names. And those were the performances that I think the emergent middle class was starting to feel uncomfortable by. But as I said, Muthulakshmi Reddy saw the act of Bottu Kattudal, which somehow, because of the Inam links, was linked up to temples as the problem. So actually, what I'm trying to say is that non-temple performances, I mean, I would use the word secular, but in a soft way, let's say, those performances have been going on for centuries in South India, right? So that the courtesan performer has always been the object of certain kinds of gazes. On the one hand, they were particularly kind of construed because they weren't necessarily the same gazes, I guess, that would be cast upon a householding woman, maybe. Although even that is a question mark, right? And I would also argue in that same vein that the gazes of the modern spectator when you go to sabhas is not all that different. So when we're thinking about the gaze, obviously the songs 100% are created in the male gaze.
I'm talking about the gaze of the performer.
Looking back. Okay. Right. So so this I've actually written about in my book. When I first saw this very same padam Okkasarike being danced by Maddula Venkataratnama, it was a real transformative experience for me, because the next day I went to her house and just started talking to her. And the first thing, I mean, I didn't even step into the house. I don't even think I'd taken my chappals off. But she just said, "How did you like that performance yesterday? And wasn't that an amazing padam?" She said, "When we dance this padam, we feel something." And that was exactly how she said it, that we feel something, that it has some kind of a transformative effect, right? And I think for us, it's important to realize that you can get very nostalgic about those kinds of things. But given that this very family, and Venkataratnama herself, in her very early years, actually lived through the tail end of social reform, right? That we also see performance in this community as something that has the potential to liberate or to provide an avenue or a form of self-expression, let's say, that is fundamentally different from the liberatory self-expression of a non-courtesan woman when they dance Bharatanatyam or whatever it is. Right? And we want to try to mark that difference a little bit in terms of the technique and the way in which we perform the dance. Right? And you might have seen that even the Abhinaya rendition is very different from most of what you would see in mainstream classical dance traditions, right? And also there's a very sparse usage of hands, and we don't necessarily re-choreograph pieces. We more or less use the choreographic kind of template that's been provided by elders in the community.
On behalf of Center for Regional Studies, Study in India program at the University of Hyderabad, and on behalf of all of you in the audience, I thank these distinguished guests, Dr. Davesh, Soneji, as Dr. Yashoda Thakore, and along with the accompanying artists, Ms. Sudha and Chandrakant. It's been a wonderful afternoon, an engaging afternoon, a performance and talk, if you will, and that's not only kind of informed us, it seems to me that it has made us pause and reflect on some of the research work that perhaps now has to follow on as part of this. It's the identity that is being interrogated, both as the political intersections of place and identity, but also the politics of the identity. That's also probably is coming through with this afternoon. So in other words, I thought the interpretation of the identities has to be in embodied terms, is where you were emphasizing right at the beginning of that. And the embodied has important implications, not just for the kind of studying our identities, but also it seems like in the terms of the producing of knowledge itself, perhaps we have to look at it. So that embodiment with the producing of knowledge, that connection has to be much more explored. There's something else that has struck me this afternoon, for that the studies were representing perhaps there may be more productive interfaces between our social sciences and humanities as well. And that's somehow based on some geographical approaches. I saw that methods and analysis, which were interviews, ethnographies, surely, but then they were also combined with textual, visual, and oral analysis as well for different sources and different practices, if you will. Dance is a creative field, and you said is a performative ritual as well. The both of those textual as well you brought in. That both put together is where we will have some more productive ways of looking at some of our research endeavors. There's also something that's coming through this for this afternoon. Our distinguished speakers this afternoon brought about also, I thought, an understanding of microgeographies practices. That's where it is essentially getting focused on. And performity in practice. Yes, I mean, there's always a tension that they don't let it retreat from the feminism and the politics of the body. But there's always a danger, as some will say, in the favor of some individualistic or some universalizing sovereign subject might be there. So that kind of, this tension is what we'll have to sort of look at it. And this is where this afternoon was a very productive, not just listening and hearing both of you, and but also seeing the performance, but also in terms of our own engagements in the research, is something we'll have to go back, and all these questions are as this. This afternoon we were very hugely assisted by the PRO department. Ashish is here, Mrs. Vijaya is here, and along with the SIP help, Ganesh and others are there. And I think this has been possible so smoothly for all their assistance that has been there for several days before this performance this afternoon. I want to thank them as well on behalf of all of us, the CRS and the SIP. Thank you one and all. Thank you.